We have the ability to predict the future. Now you may be thinking, Mike, what do you mean? I can't predict the future. If I could predict the future, I'd be wealthy and rich, right? Or I'd be in a much different situation, right? If I could predict this, but just work with me for a second. Haven't you said at some point in life these words? Right? You know, you watch their lives, you watch what's happening, and you're like, oh no, this is not going to end well. And you know what? It didn't end well. And you're like, they should have seen this coming. How could they not see this coming? You'll see somebody who says, you have a girlfriend who's like, I just don't understand. I can't believe it that he broke up with me. And you're like, really? You can't believe that? He's been like breaking up with you for like 3 months. Everybody knew he was breaking up with you, but somehow they should have seen it coming, but they didn't. Or, financially, somebody says, I don't know how I financially got in this mess. And you're like, dude, literally everybody knows how you got in this financial mess. It's not hard, right? I mean, just look at how you spend money, how you handle money. But it's like, they're always so shocked. And we think to ourselves, they should have seen it coming. So we have the ability to predict the future. In fact, some of us have used a phrase that goes like this. Now, hopefully you haven't said it to a spouse or your child, because that's not a good relationship thing, right? That's better just to keep to yourself, not to say I told you so. Just say, that's interesting how things work. That's your line, right? Because when you say, I told you so, it sounds like, it sounds like, you're kind of, And you want to be that person, right? So, that's interesting. Amazing how that happens, right? But we've all said that, I told you so, because we were able to predict what was going to happen. In fact, there are moments even in our own life when we say this to ourselves. We should have seen that coming. Normally we say this because we didn't see it coming, right? But we say that, how could I miss that? I should have seen this coming, but again, we didn't. So here's my question, just to get us thinking a little more today. Why is it that we can see what they can't see? Why? Did we have some sort of special ability that is able to see what some people can't see? But here's the flip of it. Why is it that they can see what we can't see? And here's my conclusion for just us as human beings. This is not a religious thing. This is just a people thing. Which is kind of harsh, it seems like, right? But it's pretty true. I haven't seen it because I really don't want to see it. And we all have our ways of doing this, how we ignore things, how we, sort of justify things, how we work. But we don't want to face up to the reality of this happening. When we arrive at where we were headed, we're shocked and surprised. Even though, again, the people around us aren't shocked and surprised. And oftentimes they're like, yeah, I tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen, right? In fact, when I tried to tell you, you got really kind of snippy about it, like, mind your own business. And so I did, and now we're here. But it's a reminder that we can predict the future. The reality is we just don't like to. And it all comes back to that word that we started with today, this word direction. Where we're headed. And it's something for us to stop and think about our own lives, the direction that we're headed. Because this is a principle that works for us or against us. This is something we can tap into. If we get headed in that direction and begin to commit to it, begin to work it out, it pays off. But sometimes it's a long process. And that's part of the challenge with this idea, this principle, is that it's not an instantaneous thing. It's not like simply if I turn my direction, now life is so much better and wonderful, everything just works out. No, turning direction takes some energy, takes some effort, and I have to get along the direction in order to get closer to the place I want to get, the destination I want to get. And there's times that there's a disconnect between what we intend to do and where we end up. Some of you have stories about this, right? Stories of, you intended to do this and you followed your dreams and it turned out your dream was more nightmare, right? Because it just didn't work out the way you thought it. And again, it was because of the direction you were headed. Maybe it wasn't a bad dream. Maybe it was just about the direction you went to fulfilling that dream. And here's what I've observed over a lot of years of life. We can be living in the wrong direction. Now, I know that may be kind of hard, and I'm not pointing at anybody, but we can be living in the wrong direction and be content and happy. There have been periods of my life I've lived in the wrong direction. I was happy. I was content because I was doing what I wanted to do, and that's, Who doesn't want to do what they want to do? And if you find yourself in knowing that you're heading not in the direction that's supporting where you really ultimately want to end up, but you're happy and content about it, here's a question I just want to ask for, as your friend, as your pastor, trying to get you to think about it. What if the consequences of our direction haven't hit us yet? Because what I've discovered over life is the consequences at some point hit us when we're going not in the direction that's good or healthy for us. At some point, the consequences get big enough that they stop us. But here's another part of it as well. We can be living in the wrong direction and be unhappy and dissatisfied. And maybe you find yourself in that, right? You're like, yeah, life is not working like it's supposed to. It's like I thought it would. Things aren't, happening the way I wish they would. And I'm just really unhappy. I'm dissatisfied. I'm frustrated. And I don't know what to do. And in my mind, that's an important place to get to, because it's when we oftentimes begin to feel the reality of our directions that we're willing to stop and maybe consider heading in a different direction. Because here's what's true. We can want to change, we can mean to change, we can intend to change, but until we change, nothing is going to change. Which may be the thing that somebody here today needs to hear. We can want to, we can desire, we can, just wish upon it, hope for it, but until we actually do it, nothing's going to change. Here's a way I heard it put years ago in a religious context. We can't pray our way out of a situation we behaved our way into. Prayer is powerful, prayer is great, but prayer doesn't fix everything. Especially if we've behaved our way, we've gone in a direction and find ourselves there. Praying, it doesn't automatically put us out of that. But praying can help us tap into somebody who can help give us the strength and the courage and face the reality to make the change that we need to make. And here's the great thing about this whole idea about direction ends up being, where we end up. Jesus actually talked about this. In fact, he talked about it during one of his most famous speeches he ever gave. It's found over in Matthew chapter 5, and actually goes from Matthew chapter 5 all the way through Matthew chapter 7, which simply means it was a long, long speech. In fact, people, if you looked at it as a speech to follow, a pattern to follow, we would say it's a terrible pattern to follow, because Jesus covers way too much stuff. He throws too much stuff out to people. He didn't give them just something to think about. He gave them way too much to think about. And I'm not trying to criticize Jesus. I'm just saying, if you look at it, it's like there's way too much. I think Jesus' point was he was just trying to sort of blow people's mind in order to get them to open their mind. So a little backstory. This is fairly early in Jesus' ministry, right? He ministers for like 3.5 years. What we call his public ministry, where he goes out and preaches, where he heals people, where he does a bunch of amazing stuff, and then he gets arrested and crucifies and dies and comes back to life. That's the basic Jesus story. But at the start here, he has at least 4, maybe 5 or 6 disciples. He doesn't have all 12 disciples yet. He's just got a few of them. And things, he's gotten this handful of guys. They've started to go out. Jesus started to teach. He started to heal people. And when people starts to heal people, word gets out. Because you can imagine today, if we had somebody who could heal anybody of anything, it wouldn't take long for wherever that person's at to be just overflowed, right? Especially when it's not like I'm charging it for it. I'm just giving it away freely. People are going to show up. And even back then, when it was hard to get from place to place, people still showed up. And that's where we pick up the story, is that, Jesus sees these crowds that have all of a sudden started to gather around. They're wanting healing and wanting all these things, and the disciples are trying to keep up. And Jesus says, okay, here's what we're going to do. Let's just get them up on this mountainside, on this hillside, and let's get them to sit down. And he gets them to sit down, and then Matthew, as he remembers the story, says he began to teach them. And he begins to teach them this, again, long thing that covers so much about life and about how to approach life. But at the very end of his message, Jesus says some words that, again, are about this idea of not only direction, but about a foundation. When he says, listen, everyone who hears my words and obeys, that is, acts on them, that practices them. Everyone who not only just hears my words, but actually begins to live them out, begins to follow them in their life. Everybody who does that will experience instant relief, spiritually, emotionally, relationally, physically, and financially. I'm glad somebody laughed because that's not true. Jesus didn't say that. I apologize, Jesus, that you didn't say that. But sometimes we think that, right? That if I just kind of turn my life, it's supposed to be magic, that Jesus kind of just sprinkles some kind of magic dust on me and life gets ultimately instantaneously better. Everything gets fixed in life. Or maybe our version would be, everyone who hears my words and obeys them will have all of their problems solved, which would be really great, but not true again. Because the reality is, Jesus never promised to fix our problems. Rather, he invites us to live in a different direction. A direction that if we follow it, ends up changing a lot of those problems. Because if we change direction, things eventually change. I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it in lots of other people's lives. That when you begin to change direction, eventually things begin to change. Things begin to work differently because now we're headed in a different direction. So here's actually what Jesus said. Everyone who hears my words and obeys, that is, acts on them, that practices them, is like a wise, like a sensible man. So Jesus maybe sounds kind of self-serving, like, hey, I'm so smart. If you follow me, you're really wise. But that's not what Jesus is saying. He's just saying simply that a wise person is someone who understands that life is connected. That where we're headed is what determines where we end up. That what we do today impacts tomorrow. And what we do tomorrow impacts the next day, right? What we, our past, it impacts our present, and our present will impact our future. A wise person recognizes that all of life works together. That I can't compartmentalize and keep things separate because at some point, that's a direction that just can't be sustained. Everyone who hears my words and obeys, acts and practices them is like a wise and sensible man who built his house on rock. Now, when people hear this, this wasn't like this was a made-up story that Jesus tells. It's sort of adding, it's kind of more of an illustration than a story. But when he talks about it being built on a rock, what he's talking about is the hard way, the expensive way, the time-consuming way, because to build something on rock means you got to work with rock, and rock is not really that workable, right? You got to bore a bunch of stuff, and back then, a whole different kind of context than the tools we have today. But Jesus is talking about building this house on a very firm foundation, a very solid thing that can't be moved. In fact, the next thing he said was this, that when it rained hard, when the floods came, and the winds blew and beat, and as it slammed against the house, it didn't collapse because it was built on the rock. And Jesus pointed out that in our lives, it's about the choices we make. It's about the direction we're going. And the reality is life has its storms, right? Some of us have had rain come in our lives. Sometimes rain is good. Sometimes rain is not so good. The picture he paints here of the winds lashing at the house. Some of you have been through some incredible, crazy stuff the last few months. Winds all over the place. And it's just like everything's hitting you, right? And it feels like everything's going to get shaken apart. And Jesus is saying the way to not be shaken apart is based on what your foundation is. Because this is on the flip side, everyone who hears my words and does not obey them, who does not act them, does not practice them, who does not follow them, is like a stupid man who built his house on sand. Now, when Jesus' original hearers heard them say sand, they all went, ooh, bad idea, right? Because everybody knows you built something on sand, that's not a smart move. Because sand is not very solid, right? Sand washes away, sand blows away, sand will give away. And a foolish person, Jesus would remind us, is someone who lives their life as if it's disconnected. That now is now. It's all about now. Hey, I don't have to worry about tomorrow. I don't have to worry about saving money. Later is later. Today's today. Let's live it up today. Let's make the choice about today, not about tomorrow. But a wise person would say, today's choices do affect the choices I have tomorrow, so maybe I need to think those things through. Which, by the way, sounds so hard and so boring. Which is why this way is so appealing. But Jesus went on and said, listen, it rained hard, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat, that it slammed against the house, and it collapsed with a big crash. I love the fact that Jesus says, with a big crash. He doesn't just it just collapses. It's like, no, this collapsed and it just is obliterated. It blows the house apart because it doesn't have any kind of foundation. Because the reality is the foundation is what makes the difference. And the foundation for Jesus, strangely enough, is doing. It's in the direction. It's about those who not only hear my words, but actually let those words in their life and change their direction of life. In fact, just a few moments before Jesus said these words 2,000 years ago, he said something else that went along with this. He said, not all of those who say to me, you're our Lord, 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 will enter the kingdom of heaven. Not everybody who kind of claims me as their Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven, which makes us kind of go, Jesus, that sounds, I thought this was about believing in you. But Jesus says, no, it's about believing in me, but it's about believing in me in a way that you actually put your faith and your trust in me. Because only those who do what my Father in heaven wants are the ones who enter into heaven. It really is about the doing part. Not the doing to earn the way, but the doing to be in the way. Because following, I want you to notice this, following isn't the requirement of being a follower. What you're thinking right now, Mike, it has to be, right? Because following is part of being a follower. But following isn't the requirement of being a follower, it's the definition of it. Thank you for right? It's not the requirement, it's actually the definition. That's what Jesus is talking about. Being my follower means you actually follow. When I take a few steps, you follow that way. When I sit down, you sit down. When we turn around, you go a different direction, that's where you go. And when you read enough of Jesus' teaching, especially this section that we call the Sermon on the Mount, because he preached this message on this hillside, you discover that the center of Jesus' teaching is how we treat people. It's at the core of this. And here's the good thing. It includes us, which ought to be good news. But here's the balancing aspect of it. But it's not limited to us. It's about more than us. In fact, it's really much more other-centered than it is us-centered. So back to the very beginning of this message Jesus preached on this hillside, here's what he said. Blessed. Blessed are those who realize their spiritual poverty. Literally, who are poor in spirit. And that's what it means. Poor in spirit doesn't mean they don't have any spirit, but it means that they recognize the reality. Sort of like people that are in poverty, people that are poor. You don't have to tell people that are in poverty that they're poor. They kind of know it. But Jesus says, blessed are those who realize that they're spiritually poor. That they're not perfect, that there's lots of room for growth, lots of room for change. Blessed are those. No, blessed are those who grieve, who mourn, because God will comfort them. And most scholars, theologians who look at this say, the mourning here is not just about being sad because, grieving the loss of a loved one, as hard and as important as these things are. It's really about grieving and being sad about, our own lives and our multiple failures to live up to this picture that God has for us, that Jesus has for us. And Jesus says, even in the midst of being, sad that we haven't done what we wish we had done, right? We intended to do, but haven't done. Even those people can be blessed because God will comfort them. And one of the ways that God comforts us is to say, okay, let's make a little adjustment. Let's turn and let's head in a different direction. Blessed are those who are humble, who are gentle. And all of these have an explanation of why. For God, they'll have the kingdom of God, that God will be with them. Those are the kind of things. But there's something in God's eyes, apparently, that humbleness represents that non-humbleness doesn't. I'm not even sure non-humbleness is a word, but, arrogance, boastfulness. I'm going to stop there because I'm getting some dangerous ground. All right, so blessed are those who are humble, right? And those who hunger and thirst after justice. The word is righteousness, and oftentimes when you hear this passage translated, it's those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, this idea of being right with God. That's what they thirst after. But actually, the word can also mean justice, and it's interesting that so often we leave the justice part out and we look at the right living part, but Jesus would remind us that right living has justice at its heart. And Jesus says, they're blessed who not only want justice, but who actually hunger after it, who thirst after it, who push and live in that direction of wanting to have justice, not just for themselves and my rights and I demand this and I that, but justice for everybody. Blessed are those who show mercy to others. This is one of my favorite ones. Because here's the payoff. For God will show mercy to them. That Jesus links up how we handle mercy with our own experience of mercy. Blessed are those whose thoughts, whose hearts are pure. Because those are the kind of people that will see God. Because they've gotten a lot of the bad stuff out, the ugly stuff out, the impure stuff out, and that helps them see God in a much different way. Begin to understand in a greater depth how much God loves them, how much God cares for them, how much God wants for them. Blessed are those who work for peace. Not just those who keep the peace, but those who actually work for peace. This isn't kind of, let's be careful around, we got the holidays coming up. Let's be careful around Aunt Betty, because when she's around, we don't want to mention topics because we're going to get upset, So we're going to keep the peace, but it's not about keeping the peace, it's about working for peace. Somehow building on some kind of connections that can bring us together. Blessed are those who are persecuted for doing what's right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. And I'm glad that Jesus reminds us that when we get, in trouble for doing what's right, there's a payoff, because it's a picture of what the kingdom is like. Not the persecution part, but the doing right in spite of whatever happens. Now, when you look at that list that Jesus started this message on, that's where he starts. Blessed are, the poor in spirit, right? Blessed are those who are mourn, and blessed finally those who are persecuted, right? That's how he starts off this message to this huge crowd that day. And I'm guessing, if we were to take some time, and hope today or this week you'll take some time and start with Matthew 5 and work through Matthew 7, read the whole thing, get the whole story that Jesus has there. When I read it, I come away with one thought, and one thought only. This is my thought. Right? To be a peacemaker, one who creates peace, who's always fighting for justice, who's always showing mercy to other people, who's being honest about my own spiritual failures. But when I think about things that are hard, here's what the thought that pops in my mind. Hardness is more often a sign of a right decision than a wrong one. Have you noticed that? That's hard, and the reason it's hard, because, it's a hard thing to do, but that more often in my life than not, the hard things have been the right things. It's the easy things that have always gotten me in trouble. Back to Mark Manson, he said, the only way to feel better about yourself is to do things worth feeling good about. Which I think is a brilliant insight. Sometimes we talk about self-esteem and how we see ourselves, and his point is, you can actually help that. Go and do something good. Go and do something that will make you feel good, because then you have a reason to feel good about yourself. You can't think your way into a better life. You have to live it. So let me close with just a thought today. If we're living in a direction that's not going to get us where we want to go, if that kind of represents you, that you kind of know, yeah, my direction probably, Mike, isn't kind of going in the direction that I really want to end up, but right now I'm young, I'm having a good time, I'm single, whatever. We have our excuses. But if we're living in a direction that's not going to get us where we want to go, here's my final question. Why keep heading in that direction? Something to think about today.